and welcome to The Edge, where we take an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We'll bring you not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. So let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. Olympic gymnast Simone Biles held back tears on Wednesday as she told lawmakers how the FBI and US gymnastic and Olympic officials failed to stop the abuse that she and hundreds of other athletes suffered from former doctor Larry Nassar. Emotional hearing painted a damning picture of the FBI, which handled the Nassar investigation so badly that he was able to continue abusing more victims for over a year before he was finally arrested. How has this case affected the image of the FBI? British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is continuing to rebuild his ministerial team after conducting a major cabinet reshuffle on Wednesday. Johnson is promising to build back better from the pandemic. He's now expected to rejig his junior and middle-ranking ministers in a process which could take days. Who is in Boris Johnson's new cabinet and what changes are expected? Palestinian prison escapee Mohammed al-Arida was reportedly subjected to torture following his recapture by Israeli authorities after 6 Palestinian inmates tunneled out of the high-security VILDAN prison in northern Israel on the 6th of September. According to observers, there are around 4,850 Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons, including women and children. What can the international community do to prevent such torture? And these are the top 3 stories that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. The long-awaited watchdog report raises troubling questions about the department and how the FBI handled the Nassar case. It highlights major missteps at the FBI between the time the allegations were first reported and Nassar's arrest. Our following infographic explains. American gymnasts testified at a hearing against the FBI's failure to follow up on reports of abuse at the hands of former US gymnastics doctor Larry Nassar.
70,000 pages.
Olympic gymnast Michaela Maroney on Wednesday told US lawmakers she feels betrayed by FBI agents after they failed to seriously investigate former USA gymnastics doctor Larry Nassar, despite her telling them he had sexually abused her. Maroney is one of 4 athletes, along with Simone Biles, IBRAHIM and Maggie Nichols, who testified to the Senate Judiciary Committee as it probes the FBI's mishandling of the investigation.
The committee will be the truth.
I don't want another young gymnast, Olympic athlete, or any individual to experience the horror that I and hundreds of others have endured before, during, and continuing to this day in the wake of the Larry Nassar abuse. To be clear,
Take your time.
To be clear, I blame Larry Nassar, and I also blame an entire system that enabled and perpetrated his abuse.
What the FBI actually did with the information she provided, failing to document it for a year and a half and misrepresenting what she told them about her experiences.
Unwavered. And let me just come right to the reason we're here today. It's not only that the FBI failed to do its job systematically and repeatedly, it is also the cover-up that occurred afterward when FBI agents made material false statements and deceptive omissions referred by the Inspector General for criminal prosecution. Those referrals were declined without explanation.
Wednesday's hearing comes after the Justice Department's Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, in July issued a scathing report which blasted the FBI for botching its investigation in a series of errors that allowed the abuse to continue for months. The FBI's investigation into Nassar started in July 2015, after USA Gymnastics President and CEO Stephen Penny reported the allegations to the FBI's Indianapolis field office. Nassar has been found guilty in 3 separate cases, with one of the prison sentences running up to 175 years. Prosecutors have estimated he sexually assaulted hundreds of women and girls.
And I joined live from New Orleans in the United States by Robert Collins, who was a professor of urban studies and public policy at Dillard University. Professor Collins, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge.
Hello.
This is a shocking case from so many different angles, not just the facts of the case, but also the way it was mishandled in its investigations. What's your reaction to this situation?
Well, it's a very tragic situation, both for the young women that were that were involved, as well as for USA Gymnastics and for USA Sports in general. You know, I have the Inspector General's report from the U.S. Justice Department in front of me, and of course they did a full investigation, and you know, they're making basic procedural recommendations as to how they can improve the you know, their investigation procedures in the past. But you know, that doesn't really seem to be the problem to me. It wasn't so much that their technical procedures were incorrect, even though I guess they can always be improved. It's just the culture within USA Sports and really within USA culture in general, that a person in power can get away with this sort of activities, because when people who are powerless bring the allegations to the law enforcement authorities, they're not taken seriously. They're pushed aside. They're cast aside. And so the person who's doing the abuse, if they're in a position of power, does not get the necessary amount of scrutiny, does not get the necessary amount of investigation into the situation. And you know, we've seen this over and over again, not just with sports, but just in general with people in positions of power within the United States.
And to be fair, that's the investigative side of this, the problems that have been highlighted by this case. I imagine many countries around the world, I remember from my time in the UK, cases of abuse have historically been downplayed or pushed aside, and the onus has been very largely put on the victims to prove their case, even when it gets to the court. But as we say, this situation has problems in so many different areas, as you quite rightly point out, the endemic problems in society, as well as any problems systematic problems in law enforcement side. So, from what's come out of the case, the FBI have, Christopher Wray has said, has accepted that that this is a terrible state of affairs, should never have happened. Does this mean that the FBI will now look again at how it proceeds with cases like this?
Well, of course, in fairness to Director Wray, he was not director at the time that the investigation started, so we can't personally blame him. But yes, I mean, I do think he's going to launch some internal investigations. The lead agent in the case has been fired, has been terminated, and one of the other agents in the case has retired because he was going to be fired if he did not retire. If he did not retire. Now, of course, some people are saying that criminal charges should be brought against those agents for negligence. I doubt that's going to happen. The FBI very seldom charges its own agents. But there has to be, what direct? I mean, if I was advising Director Wray, my position, my recommendation to him was the recommendations that I see in the Inspector General's report, all of which were accepted by the FBI. They said that they're going to implement. My recommendation would be it's not just enough to put in technical changes. You probably have to have some sort of sensitivity training for your agents, and not just for your agents, but for all FBI employees, that when a potential victim comes forward with allegations, number one, you have to take her seriously, and you have to make sure that she receives due process, even if the accused is a person in position of power. And some people would say, especially if the accused is a person in a position of power, because that a person in a position of power is going to have structures in place to deflect the abuse. What's so shocking about this is not just the abuse. Any sort of sexual abuse is shocking, but is that this went on for years, in that there were not 3 or 4 or 5 victims. There were potentially hundreds of victims. I mean, this physician basically did this for his entire career, which spanned decades. So this is not, these were not isolated cases, and because no one took previous allegations seriously, that allowed more women to be abused because the abuse just never stopped. So that's what's really so shocking about this, is that he was able to get away with this for decades.
And there are so many abuse cases where one person has been able to get their story heard and, importantly, believed, that subsequently has uncovered many other such people. It seems to be a serial illness, if you like, that abusers fall into such patterns. Now, the recommendations you've been talking about are pertinent for the FBI. They're probably also pertinent, as I suggested earlier, for other law enforcement agencies. Could you just explain for us, for those of us outside of the United States, why particularly is the FBI involved in this case and not, for example, local police forces?
Well, so there were 2 jurisdictional issues here. Number one, the abuse crossed state lines. So whenever you have crimes that take place in more than one state, the U.S. government, the U.S. government's official law enforcement agency, which is the primary investigative agency, is the FBI, is going to have prime jurisdiction in those cases. Also, number 2, it involved an employee of USA Gymnastics, which is, of course, funded by the U.S. government, since that's a member of the official U.S. Olympic team. And so for those 2 reasons, the FBI had primary jurisdiction in this case. You know, when you have abuse that crosses state lines, it becomes problematic. Yes, you can bring it to a local police officer, but the problem is then he's going to have to get if you know for abuse that happened while they were traveling in other states, that police officer is going to have to check with all those other jurisdictions, and you might have 5 or 10 or 20 different jurisdictions, sure, and everybody's going to have to do an investigation. So that's why in those cases, when abuse crosses state lines, the FBI has primary jurisdiction as the U.S. government's primary investigative body.
Well, let's hope that now this report has come out and it's being taken seriously by Christopher Wray. As you quite rightly said, he wasn't involved in the original instances, but he does carry the burden of correcting the situation so it doesn't happen again into the future. Let's hope that these lessons are learned, and they're learned by other bodies around the world who might be dealing with similar sad circumstances. Robert Collins, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge and sharing your expertise with us. An internal investigation by the Justice Department released in July said that the FBI made fundamental errors in the probe and did not treat the case with utmost seriousness after US Gymnastics first reported the allegations to the FBI's field office in Indianapolis in 2015. The FBI has acknowledged its own conduct was inexcusable. We do indeed hope that such errors will not happen again in the future and that cases like these will be taken seriously. For now, let's move on to our next topic to speak about the cabinet reshuffle in Britain. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson shook up his cabinet on Wednesday, attempting to move on from a series of political missteps and get his agenda of levelling up economic opportunities across Britain after the pandemic back on track. Our infographic has more. On Wednesday, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson made a series of cabinet reshuffles, with some decisions coming as more of a surprise than others.
Has got absolutely nothing to say.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has demoted his Foreign Secretary in a major reshuffle after months of criticism of several of his top team for missteps and gaffes. Johnson finally started a process some say he wanted to make weeks earlier to make the changes he says he needs to press on with his levelling up agenda.
Are you still the Foreign Secretary?
Johnson has made tackling regional inequality a priority, part of an agenda set in 2019, when he won the biggest Conservative majority since Thatcher, but which has been eclipsed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Dominic Raab, who has faced calls to resign since he went to holiday in Crete during the Taliban advance on Kabul, lost one of the so-called great offices of state in the Foreign Office to become Justice Minister. To soften the blow, Raab was also appointed Deputy Prime Minister, a role he played in all but name when he stepped in to lead government when Johnson was hospitalised with COVID last year. Liz Truss was promoted from Trade to the Foreign Office, become only the second woman in Britain to hold the position. Michael Gove, seen as a key player in the Johnson government, was moved to housing from his position in the cabinet.
Are you expected to be sacked?
Rumours of a reshuffle and who might be on their way up or on their way out have been swirling for weeks. Some in his party had suggested the threat of a reshuffle helped ensure Johnson's plans for a tax rise to tackle a crisis in health and social care got party backing after it was widely criticised for hurting the lowest earners the most.
of the opposition, Keir Starmer.
Critics accuse Johnson of choosing Wednesday to overshadow the opposition Labour Party's planned vote in Parliament on the government's decision to scrap extra support for low-income families. But some Conservative lawmakers said it had simply been long overdue. One lawmaker described the cabinet as a boat which was appallingly encrusted with barnacles.
Mr. Speaker, vote Labour, wait longer.
And I'm joined live from London by political analyst Tom Packer. Tom, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge. What's the reshuffling of a cabinet is something that happens not infrequently in governments, so it's on the face of it, this isn't a great shock. But two questions. How anticipated was this reshuffle, and is it just moving around the chairs on the deck of the Titanic? Is it actually going to bring any change?
So I think it was pretty anticipated. In fact, lots of people talked to one immediately after the tax rise a few days ago, and it was to a lot of people a bit of a surprise there wasn't one, but instead they waited a few days. There's been a lot of stability during COVID. Any vacancies that have merged have just been filled up without a full reshuffle. So it was pretty expected. Like, people wouldn't have been amazed if it hadn't happened, but it was pretty well expected. I wouldn't say moving diagonals on the Titanic. For an incumbent government, the government's quite popular, so I'm skeptical how long that will last myself. But I think if I was to describe this, I would say, one, it was a feeling you had to have a reshuffle. Britain is a parliamentary system, so the MPs ultimately decide who's in government. And lots of Tory MPs, particularly in the newest intakes, were being frustrated they'd never get senior roles. Some ministers have become unpopular. Johnson probably wanted to shore up his own hand, and I think he did so in various ways. So it was elements of being an inevitable reshuffle and a bit of a reshuffle that was trying to strengthen the Prime Minister a bit and make the government a bit more in his own image.
And many would say that this actually is what it's all about. It's about Boris Johnson trying to keep his hold on power. But then that in a sense is what again all prime ministers do. Is this new face of Boris one that's going to take him forward into the future?
I think so. I mean, Boris Johnson is famous for not really liking causing pain to people, so I don't think he enjoys like big, brutal reshuffles. So it's quite striking how they've been very careful to say that everyone who's been fired has actually done a very good job. This is much more about revamping the government than anyone having done anything wrong there in that sense. So I think he's probably going to be a prime minister who doesn't reshuffle very often, which is probably a virtue, to be honest. But I think, I'm very much agreeing with your report. I think if one was to see the most significant change, it would be Liz Truss being made Foreign Secretary. And there's a lot of talk this might be an attempt. At the moment, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is very clearly the successor apparent, probably in some ways more popular with the Conservative Party than Johnson himself. So by promoting a minister who's seen, rightly or wrongly, as having done well lately, he's maybe creating a possible alternative to Rishi Sunak. As a kind of prospective leader, and so in turn making Johnson stronger. Which
carries the ball forward. Now, some of the firings or demotions, in fact, haven't exactly been a demotion. Thinking particularly of Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who's gone to the Justice Department, also become a Deputy Foreign Minister. And I think he has another position as well. How has that been received?
A Deputy Prime Minister, sorry, not Deputy Foreign Minister, which, yes, it's hard to see how he could be demoted to being Deputy Prime Minister. I mean, Dominic Raab has had very bad press lately because of the problems in Afghanistan. I mean, how much that's even to do with Britain, never mind Dominic Raab personally, I think. One's entitled to a lot of skepticism. It certainly hurt him a lot. So, for example, if you look at a poll of Conservative Home does of Tory party members, Dominic Raab was one of the 4 or 5 ones at the bottom, and all the others have been pushed out of the government altogether. So So I think it's seen striking that was the one that took longest. So the conventional wisdom, which is probably right, is Johnson said, I want to make you Justice Secretary, but not Foreign Secretary anymore. And Raab said, OK, but only if you make me Deputy Prime Minister formally, as well as the second most senior man in the government. And Johnson said, OK. I still think Raab's career could revive. I mean, one thing worth noting is his predecessor had already taken steps to weaken the power and activism of the judiciary. And Dominic Raab has a very long history, going back over a decade, of strongly supporting changes along these lines. He's a highly qualified lawyer. He's identified with the right wing of the Conservative Party. His predecessor was on the centre-left. So we might well get more noise, particularly as Boris Johnson tends to only like to take radical actions when they're popular. And the one area where there's a lot of evidence of popular discontent is on some of the things judges have done in terms of making it, or ruled, I should say, rather than done, making it very hard to deport serious criminals and the like. So I suspect we may see even more action from the Justice Department in the next year or two. And possibly, though it depends how it's received, a revival of Mr. Raab's popularity.
And in fact, perhaps one of the other, we know this government particularly likes dabbling with public relations. Probably after Afghanistan, moving Raab will actually take away the blight of the Afghanistan withdrawal, take the spotlight off him from there, and giving him a fresh position, as you say, might give him better opportunities for the future. But the Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary has been highly critical, hasn't he? He's saying, pointing a failed Foreign Secretary just fired for being missing in action. It's the 6th Justice Secretary in years. Shows how little this government cares about victims of crime. Is that a fair slur from the Shadow Justice Secretary?
I mean, I would say Conservatives tend to regard justice as an easy area for them, so they're less worried about having someone who can fix it and stay on the job long term. Politically, the public tends to be to the right on justice, just as it's to the left on the NHS. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think there's something in it. I mean, I think failed Foreign Secretary depends on your view. My view, for what it's worth, is Dominic Raab was very unlucky that he was Foreign Secretary when the Americans withdrew. There were bound to be problems. I think the notion that it wasn't like he was in charge of evacuating people personally. I think the notion that him going on holiday was a problem. He just got a lot of bad media attention. I agree with what you're saying about governments generally being very concerned about PR. There's an interesting change in this government in that Dominic Cummings wasn't very concerned about the media cycle in quite the same way as previous political figures were. So when he was very influential in the government, it took a slightly different attitude. It almost thought it was good news to fight the media. That's really changed since he was pushed out the end of last year. Mm-hmm. So I think there's much more of a government that if you have good press, you get promoted. If you have bad press, you get demoted. But, Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary isn't much demotion. And I think that's one reason why Johnson hasn't fired him, is it would look a bit sticky. Raab would be able to say, well, what did I have to do with everything that's gone wrong? And it would create a powerful enemy. So I think it made sense not to push him out, frankly, and I see why Johnson didn't.
Now, one of the important positions in the Cabinet is, of course, education, which in previous times we've seen an education minister rise to be Prime Minister. But that isn't going to be the fate, it seems, for Mr Williamson, who the opposition have been trying to get kicked out for some time over his handling of education during the pandemic. How is education looking for this next phase?
That would be an interesting question. I mean, he is a slightly inspiring story. He came to He came to England at the age of 11, and was, I think, at one point supposedly his teacher thought he had such bad English he must have special needs. So he's done very well for himself, and it's quite inspiring. Gavin Williamson, I think there are perhaps some fair criticisms. How much it was his fault, I think, is very easy to see, but it's very hard to see, rather. But but certainly it has very bad performance. There's continually delaying exams, continually having the teaching unions block the chance to hold exams. So Britain had very important exams at 16 and 18, which decide in many ways children's future. So having not had them, it's all had to go on predicted grades, which unsurprisingly have been a lot more generous. So it's all been a bit of a disaster. So it's not surprising he's been pushed out. But I wouldn't rule him out. He's a very talented politician, Mr Williamson. And after seeing Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labour Party, anything's possible. It's also worth noting Education Secretary, while it matters, is not usually seen as a really top-tier one. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm right in saying the only Education Secretary to become Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher. And she was possibly the biggest upset for becoming Tory leader, of any Tory leader. We forget this with hindsight because she became such a major figure, but she was very much a second-tier figure who unexpectedly won a leadership against a weak Tory leader.
Well, she certainly did win it and held on to it, held on to it. So many surprises and changes. Some expected changes didn't come about. We'll see over the next few days how everything settles out. Of course, the good news is that Larry the Cat is still in charge of Downing Street, so so some things continue as normal. Tom Packer, I want to thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge and giving us your snapshot of the current situation. Now, after the early traumas of Brexit, then the emergency and horror of the pandemic, the moves represents, they hope, a refreshed team. They can get things done. The coming days will reveal all the changes for the new cabinet and whether it will deliver the expected results. But for now, let's move to our final topic to speak about Israel's continuing atrocities against Palestinians. Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip are facing atrocities every day. But why is Gaza so important? Our following infographic explains. Tensions have been running high since 6 Palestinian inmates staged a dramatic escape from a high-security jail in northern Israel last week, with new information suggesting that 4 of them were badly tortured after being recaptured.
Palestinian prison escapee Mohammed al-Arida was subjected to torture following his recapture by Israeli authorities, according to a lawyer affiliated with the Palestinian Prisoner Society. Khaled Mahajna made a statement to official Palestinian television after meeting with al-Arida, saying the prisoner underwent harsh torture and was badly beaten. The lawyer said al-Arida has severe wounds all over his body but has still not received any treatment and has barely slept. Al-Arida denies all accusations, Mahajna said, noting the prisoner opted to remain silent during the interrogation despite the torture and pressure. The Palestinian Prisoner Society said it would talk to all 4 of the caught escapees on 20 September. 6 Palestinian inmates tunneled out of the high-security Gilboa prison in northern Israel on 6 September. Israeli forces, however, have managed to capture 4 of them after a manhunt. The remaining 2 are still in hiding. There are around 4,850 Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons, including 41 women, 225 children, and 540 administrative detainees, according to observers.
Most of the detainees are being held without trial or charges as political prisoners who are in detention because of the Israeli military occupation or their resistance to it. Now, our analysts have provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. Now, before closing our programme, let's have a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions on today's top stories shared with the hashtag Zakaria Zubeidi. And here's what you've been saying about Zakaria Zubeidi on Twitter. IBRAHIM says, don't stop talking about what's happening to the Palestinian prisoners. They are in danger. KAYIS says the Israeli occupation robbed his childhood and now his youth and his entire life. Zakaria deserves better. And Omar Aladdin says, don't stop talking about what's happening to the Palestinian prisoners. Don't stop talking about Zakaria al-Zubeidi. Let's now take a look at our video of the day, which tells the nearly 1 million children were born into refugee life in just 3 years. And that's all from this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boyns. Stay tuned as we'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.